Hey there, and welcome to the Net of the Weaver. You probably heard of Vampire the Masquerade before. If you have but don't know too much about it, or if you never have and just think it sounds kind of cool, this video is for you. If you already know all there is to know about Vampire the Masquerade, then what I'll talk about here probably won't be new to you, but you can still stick around. Maybe you'll find something new with me rambling about it, or just want to refresh your memory on some basic stuff. Vampire is a pretty old system by now after all, with a ton of books released about it. It's easy to lose track there. With that being said, this video will only cover the very basics of the game's lore. There have been tons of books written about Vampire the Masquerade, and pretty much every storyteller runs their game just a little bit differently, so this is just a very tip of the iceberg. And I'll probably skip about a lot of theories and possibilities. With that being said, let's go. Vampire the Masquerade takes place in the world of darkness, which is basically our world, but, well, darker. Imagine your average day, but the weather is worse, everybody hates you, and there's only crap on the radio. One of those days. Every day. Earlier source books called this feeling gothic punk, as in that everything is dark and foreboding, like a gothic horror novel, but with the postmodern, rebellious, and urban streak the word punk implies. The world of darkness is not exactly subtle. Every last rich person is either a corrupt bastard or, if at least slightly well-meaning, a Machiavellian puppeteer. People at the other end of the ladder are either junkies who want to drag everything and everyone down with them, or former ambitious teens who had their enthusiasm and good faith crushed beneath reality's heel. Life is a bitch to everyone, basically, and it's not even remotely fair. Oh, and also supernatural beings are real, like vampires, which is what this video will be focusing on. Legend has it that vampires were created from Cain, the first murderer who slaughtered his brother Abel out of jealousy and was thus cursed by God. Some vampires have a very elaborate lore about this that they take as gospel, according to which this curse was actually vampirism. But whether anything about this is actually true remains largely unknown. However, regardless of how they got to be, vampires exist in the world of darkness. Some of their characteristics are known to mortals, while others are mixed with half-truths or just plain out wrong. So let's go over the stuff most people know about vampires and how they hold up in Vampire the Masquerade. Vampires do actually burn in sunlight and don't like fire either. Their weakness against sunlight rarely comes into play though, as they fall into a deep slumber during the daytime. A stake through the heart does not kill a vampire outright, but sends them into a paralysis that vampires call torpor. Note that the stake needs to be made largely out of wood for this to work. Weapons made from silver work as well against vampires as normal weapons do. More on that later. You don't turn into a vampire if you're just bitten by one. Turning a person into a vampire usually doesn't happen on accident, but is a deliberate process, and most vampires carefully consider whom they'll turn into one of them. Vampires can turn into bats or wolves. Only some of them. Sometimes you wish it was only that they could turn into. Also, not every vampire is some old guy with a cape and a thick accent. Vampires can be anyone, the well-established professor at university, the pretty blonde waitress, or the mysterious stranger from the Middle East. The Curse of Caine, if it is indeed that, has spread throughout the world, and while it is true that most vampires are extremely pale, that in itself does not identify them. Vampires do need blood to survive though. Some can drink from animals, but this is only a temporal fix. Sooner or later, they all need human blood. Most of the time they just grab some unsuspecting person, drink a bit of their blood and leave them be. Hardly anyone remembers this happening afterwards, and vampires can close the wounds they cause with their fangs rather easily by licking them. Some vampires have a chosen few mortals they drink from on a regular basis, which they like to call a herd. Keeping such a herd is in their interest, because getting bitten by a vampire is an awesome feeling that can leave you addicted. A herd is especially handy if you want to make sure that you will not be caught or get some nasty disease that will latch on to everyone else you drink from afterwards. Vampire blood, also called vitae, is seriously awesome stuff too. It is basically like fuel for them, as they need some every evening to get up. Vampires also have some supernatural abilities that need blood to work and need it to heal their injuries, so they can't just drink blood once and leave it at that. They can also give some of their vitae to mortals, even animals, to make them stronger and immune to aging. This requires these mortals to drink a bit of blood from a vampire monthly to keep working, and they want that too, because vitae is extremely addicting. A mortal who regularly drinks vitae is called a ghoul, and is basically madly in love with the vampire who gives them their fix. This is also called a bloodbound. A lot of vampires use ghouls to do stuff they cannot do themselves or don't want to do themselves. Ghouls aren't weak for sunlight, for example, which is extremely handy. This blood bond is not just between vampires and mortals, by the way. Vampires can be bloodbound to other vampires too, and while this doesn't make them stronger, they still are emotionally addicted to the vampire whose blood they have ingested, which can be a very bad thing. Imagine you're in love with an inhuman monster that only uses you. Thankfully, it takes more than one sip of blood from a vampire to become fully addicted. One has to drink from them 3 times over 3 different nights for it to reach its full power. Before that, they're still positively inclined towards the person they drank from, but can still think of them somewhat unbiased. To vampires, their blood is not just a useful tool and the reason for them being what they are, it is also a source of pride and elitism. Whether or not the legends about Caine are true, the fact is that every vampire's blood is just a bit thinner than their progenitors. This concept is called a vampire's generation and denotes how far removed from the original vampire they are, if such a thing exists. So the generation of the sire is always one lower than that of their child are. Usually those of lower generations look down on higher generations. This is not completely unfounded too, as lower generations can become far more powerful with time than higher ones. This very real difference in power has, of course, spawned a lot of envy and hate. Still, the generation one is reborn with cannot be lowered, unless you completely drain the blood of a vampire of a lower generation than you, completely annihilating them in the process. This is called diablerie. A lot of vampires despise this act and kill anyone who has performed it on sight. But it is alluring. Their blood also links vampires to a family of sorts of other vampires called a clan. When a mortal is turned into a vampire, they inherit the clan of their sire as well. This gives them access to unique powers, but also marks them with a distinct weakness that differs for every clan. Most weapons work on vampires as they do on humans, with some exceptions. Wooden stakes through the heart completely paralyze a vampire, as said before. Projectile weapons are not as dangerous to them as to humans though, and anything short of a headshot, a shotgun from close distance, or anything like that is not a good way to hurt a vampire. Fire is anathema to them though, and one of the few things that can really and truly hurt them. As they are technically dead, vampires have some unique anatomical quirks. For instance, they awake every night the way they were when they died. Their vitae always restores them to how they were when they became vampires. So a vampire who had 20-inch long hair on their death day could shave themselves bald one night and still wake up with a head full of hair the next evening. This also includes body modifications like tattoos or implants, A vampire cannot keep these things unless they had them in life. Their blood also allows for them to regenerate from almost any injury, from nicks and blemishes to a cut-off limb. As long as they have enough vitae to fuel their regeneration, nothing can incapacitate a vampire for long. The only surefire way to kill them is to keep hitting them when they are down. First, they fall into a death-like state called torpor. This state can be very long, but with enough blood and time, they eventually rise from it. Similar to their bodies, a vampire's mind is inhuman to a degree. Their instincts are extremely strong, especially those connected to their own ego and sense of self-preservation. These instincts are much stronger and developed than those of humans, to the point where they are basically a malevolent entity in themselves, urging the vampire to live out their most carnal desires. Vampires call it the beast. This beast only wants to feed and to survive, and little else, and it is not picky about how it achieves this. A vampire who doesn't fight the beast will eventually become little more than an animal, driven by their most basic instincts and unable to think rationally. This thought horrifies most vampires, and over the millennia of their existence they have worked out numerous strategies to either tame the beast by occasionally indulging in some of its whims, or lock it in a metaphorical cage so it doesn't bother them. Neither of those strategies work all the time. Sometimes the beast lets loose. This especially happens when vampires are provoked or frightened. In those cases, they either lash out at everything and everyone around them in a fit of violence, or flee in terror until whatever startled them is far, far away. These states of mind are called frenzy and Rötschreck respectively, and are little more than the beast briefly taking control. With all that being said, vampires have been around quite a while, and this has led to a lot of history. Some of it is mythical, some of it backed up by people who were actually there, although this does not mean they're telling the whole truth. Still, some things are in, well, not living memory for a lot of vampires, but you know what I mean. And these events, and many, many others, still define what vampires are and how they behave to this night. A lot of historical events have shaped the society of vampires into what it is today. Events like the Omen War, the War of Chicago, the Great Prank, or the Promise of 1528 have left deep imprints into vampiric society, and their aftermaths still echo today. What led to these events and how they played out would make this video a lot longer than it already is though, so I'm just going to focus on two very important events from the Dark Ages and some from the modern days, and leave it at that. But if you want to hear more about these events, tell me in the comments, leave a like to please the almighty YouTube algorithm. I have to say this kind of stuff, YouTube likes it. Sorry. Moving on. First, the reason why vampires keep in the hidden and don't rule over humans like gods. They certainly could, but they have since abandoned this to hide from humans and do everything they can to not get noticed by them. In the Dark Ages, many vampires ruled openly. They demanded sacrifices, either in exchange for favors or just to keep the other humans alive. Eventually, this led to the Church deciding that this ungodly terror had gone on long enough, and they fought against vampires with sword, fire and faith. This Inquisition went on for years and years to come, and cost a lot of very old and powerful vampires their unlife. Those who survived this holy war know just how dangerous a lot of very dedicated humans can be, and have since decided to keep up the Masquerade, meaning they hide the fact that vampires exist from human knowledge, lest a second Inquisition happens. Humans have always vastly outnumbered vampires, and this alone makes them very dangerous. During the Inquisition, a lot of older vampires used their childer as cannon fodder. They were understandably not happy about this. And so, while many of the older vampires worked on the Masquerade and a faction to uphold it, many of the younger vampires formed their own society and marched up against the older vampires who they felt betrayed them. Still, the old vampires prevailed and eventually formed a group that would come to be known as the Camarilla. Meanwhile, the younger vampires, and some older vampires who sympathized with their ideas, formed the Anarchs, who were much more about personal freedom and breaking what they felt were unjust and inefficient laws. A while later, a third fraction emerged from part of the Anarchs who called themselves the Sabbat and believed themselves to be destined to wage war against the oldest vampires in the future and that they should prepare for it accordingly. These groups, often called sects, still exist today and form much of the political climate almost all vampires are involved in. There are some vampires who do not involve themselves with these sects, but these are either very, very old and very, very powerful, or they will soon be very, very sorry. But the focus of Vampire the Masquerade is, for the most part, the modern nights. And there has been no shortage of dramatic happenings there as well. Perhaps the most important event of the modern nights was the Second Anarch Revolt. This time it was not a spontaneous uprising, but had been planned for almost a year in advance. It took place in the United States of America and culminated into the founding of the Anarch Free State. With the US already being a battlefield between the Camarilla and the Sabbat, something that still holds true today, this was a rousing success for Anarchs all around the globe and caused many smaller uprisings in Europe especially, though none of them could imitate this success. Which, just to be fair, eventually turned sour. Most Anarchs don't like to talk about what happened to the Free State in later years, as it quickly fell into disarray, a lawless wasteland that had nothing in common with the noble ideals claimed by those who built it. Roughly around the same time, Russia was in trouble as well. Somehow, all communication ceased to work for vampires in or out of the country. They were apparently able to enter the country, but could not leave once they did. The same was true for ghouls. For a long time, the so-called Shadow Curtain seemed like an unsolvable enigma from the outside. But at the turn of the millennium, the perpetrator was slain, an incredibly ancient vampire who called herself the Baba Yaga. Who killed this ancient being or how is not widely known, but with her death, the Shadow Curtain was lifted. This event was overshadowed by perhaps one of the worst events in vampiric history, however. Just a few months before the Shadow Curtain would finally be lifted, something woke up in India. What it was, what it wanted, nobody can say, but it was so incredibly powerful that an entire vampire clan called the Ravno basically went berserk from the sheer fact that it was awake. Hundreds of Ravno died, and those few of that clan who survived have never been the same since. Whatever this being was, it is definitely dead now, but many are not put at ease by this. On the contrary. The fact that something so alien and powerful could exist in the first place frightens all vampires. All of these recent events and more, constantly rising numbers of high generation vampires for example, led many vampires to believe that Gehenna is near. By that they mean the end of all vampires, which some believe will come at the hand of their mythical forefather Caine, who will judge them. Many other vampires dismiss this as myth, of course, but even they cannot shake a feeling of unease, like the worst is still yet to come. And they are right. The world of darkness is an unfair place, and it's a one-way, downhill, all the way. Of course, there is more. I haven't even scratched the whole story here, but again, that would be a whole separate video. A lot of historic events, both real and fictional, are written about in the source books from a vampiric point of view. Some of worldwide scope, others just regarding the cities they took place in. There is also the timeline that got set up with the new Vampire 5th edition that I skipped over here because many players I know don't play with the events that transpired in that edition. But if you are interested, tell me in the comments and I'll probably make a video about the lore from Vampire 5th edition as well, which basically more or less picks up where we left here and retcons some of it. Personally, I enjoy Vampire 5th edition very much, so if given the chance to talk about it, I gladly will. And those are the very basics about vampires and their history. I hope you liked the video and maybe even got into the mood to try vampires sometimes. If you enjoyed this video, learned something or just want to help me out, leave a like, comment and consider subscribing. I know everyone says that, but it really does help out. And make sure to tell me what else about Vampire or any other system you would like to know about. Until then, till next time.